Well, it's showtime. Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to Macduff Lives. And welcome once again to our good friend Harley Schlanger. Good morning, Harley, or good afternoon, I should say.
Hi, John. How are you doing today?
Oh, man, I've been busy, busy, busy. Lots of stuff going on, and things are changing fast, both in microcosm and in macrocosm, I hope.
Yeah.
You guys have been really, really pushing hard to get people's attention as to the danger of this combination of NATO and the European Union, this new
Mhm.
partnership, and the connection of Britain and Japan in anticipation of, yet another aspect of what is shaping up to be a real danger of a World War III. And, kudos to you for your efforts. Bring us up to date. How's it going? And what do you think are the most important topics we should be bringing to people's attention?
Well, let's start with global NATO, which, as you know, we've been warning about for some time. The effort to try to extend NATO to the Pacific, not just against China, but to build an alliance that would be a military alliance, because the U.S. doesn't have a whole lot of options when it comes to a base of operations for taking on China. So, first of all, as you mentioned, there was a declaration last Friday of a EU NATO collaboration. And while this has been a de facto alliance, it's now an official alliance. And what this means is that NATO sent out the word to those European Union nations that are not in NATO that you have to back the NATO alliance. And Helga asked the question, who authorized this? Did a parliament in each country vote for it? Was this a decision of the voters, or are they speaking on your behalf? And in fact, what it means is that we're seeing now, with the British taking the lead in providing tanks to Ukraine, they're putting enormous pressure on Germany to do the same. And the German defense minister resigned a couple of days ago. There's a meeting coming up this Friday at Ramstein Air Base, the Ukraine Defense Contract or Contact Group, where the British are pressuring like hell to get the Germans and the French to provide more offensive weapons to Ukraine. At the same time, you mentioned this British-Japan agreement. Sunak's office said this is the most significant British-Japan agreement since 1902. Now, what happened in 1902? The British decided to bring Japan in as part of their anti-Russia, anti-German policy. And so they launched bond offerings to provide money to build up Japan's armaments in preparation for a war with Russia, which took place 2 years later, the Russo-Japanese War, which exposed Russia as a relatively weak nation militarily, opened the floodgates for the revolution of 1905, which nearly toppled the Tsar, and paved the way for the 1917 revolution. Now, this whole idea of a British-Japanese alliance, they went so far as to say that they would allow British soldiers in Japan and Japanese soldiers in Britain. And then the day after this was agreed to, Kishida, the Japanese prime minister, was in Washington, met with Biden after the defense and foreign ministers had met the day before, and they signed all kinds of agreements about U.S.-Japanese cooperation. Japan has increased their defense budget 26% in 1 year. And this means that Japan is going to have one of the largest military expenditures in the world. And this goes against the agreement that was made after World War II under the influence of MacArthur, which said that Japan could have a defensive capability, but not offensive. So you add Japan now together with Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, the AUKUS agreement, the nuclear sub-agreement, and the Chinese are raising the question of what's the whole point of this? What's the reason for it? Now, I think with that, we should then pivot to what else is going on, which is the Davos World Economic Forum summit going on at present. And there was I don't know if you saw this, a very interesting article in the Washington Post today on under the headline, "The Worry in Davos, Globalization is Under Siege." And what the article says is that with all the crises in the world, the war, the climate catastrophe, energy price chaos, inflation, epidemics of hunger and disease, political instability, and on and on and on, Davos is no longer so self-confident that the liberal economic hegemony is going to work, that it's a solution. And they go on to say that their fear is that they call it a perma-crisis. And the fear is that they're not going to be able to hold things together. Now, that's a legitimate fear because much of the world is reacting against what we see coming from the big push from the United States, the United Kingdom, and adopted by NATO. But I would make one point in reading this Washington Post article with all these crises they mention. These are all self-inflicted. The war was a result of not negotiating with Russia in the first place. The energy price chaos comes from sanctions and the epidemic of hunger. It was there long before there was any conflict in Ukraine. Political instability, widening economic inequality, all of this was there. And it's part of the collapse of this liberal economic order. And instead of recognizing that, they're going to try and figure out how to re-globalize. And the main speech is going to be given by Neil Ferguson, who's an apologist for the British Empire, who is going to be talking about how a re-globalization policy can work so that they can go ahead with the Great Reset, but without some of the baggage of the opposition from the rest of the world. Now, how are they going to do that? They have no other policy. Their policy is they have to loot the rest of the world. It's a cannibalization policy. And this is something that Lyndon LaRouche warned about back in 1971 and through the rest of his life, that the attempt to save a neoliberal economy requires what he called Schachtian economic policies, named after Schacht, who was the Minister of Finance under Hitler. So that's really what's happening from the top down. And I think one thing I would recommend if people didn't see it is that last Saturday we had an extraordinary conference on the unraveling the JFK and MLK assassinations by looking at the International Assassination Bureau. And we had a presentation on the terrorism in Italy. Helga Zepp-LaRouche gave a really remarkable talk on the assassinations that took place in Germany in the 80s and 90s that most people don't know about. We had a report on the assassination of Lumumba and what that meant for Africa. Jacques Cheminade spoke about the attempts against de Gaulle, which was by the same grouping, same international grouping that killed Kennedy. So it was a very profound event which looked at the question of why is it that the world is so paralyzed today? Because if you have leaders who had one thing in common, all of them were questioning this global unipolar order, starting with John Kennedy. Why can't we have negotiations? Why can't we have mutually beneficial relations? If you say that, you're putting and you're a head of state, you're putting yourself on a target for assassination. And as a result, we've seen a demoralization of political leadership and a stupefaction, as well as a corruption, and a population which looks at this and says, where's the leadership? Why would I risk myself if we have no one who's speaking sensibly about these problems? So I think if people have the time, it was a 4-hour event, but you can break it down into pieces. It's on the schillerinstitute.com from January 14th, and I'd highly recommend it.
Thank you for that, and thank you for all of the work that went into making that presentation and all of the presenters. I have not seen but a small snatch of it, and I intend to watch the whole thing. I'm particularly interested in Helga's comments about assassinations in Germany that I don't know about, but appears to fit into a pattern that we can hopefully recognize in a much broader way. As you talk about the Permanent Assassination Bureau. That sounds like Perm Index to a lot of us.
That's how we started, John. I was the moderator, and in my opening presentation, I made the point that when Jim Garrison was working on his book on the trail of the assassins, we had done a report in 1981, an executive intelligence report on Permindex, the International Assassination Bureau. And Lyndon LaRouche sent me to meet with Garrison in New Orleans to deliver that executive intelligence review special report. Garrison was very interested in it. He invited me back again, and I had lunch with him at this famous Brennan's restaurant, which you may remember from the JFK movie, where they had their regular gatherings. And from that point forward, we've been looking at this as a single unified terror operation. And if I may, just on the German situation, to bring this clearly into focus, the leading assassinations were in the 1970s, the end of the 70s, Jürgen Ponto, who was the head of Dresdner Bank. And then after the fall of the wall, Alfred Herrhausen, the chairman, CEO of Deutsche Bank, who was working on a proposal very similar to what Lyndon LaRouche had, which is that instead of shock therapy, the West should go in and help rebuild the industry in the former Soviet Union and the East Bloc nations, because they had a skilled workforce, an educated workforce, but they had a lack of capital and lack of access to some of the technologies that were developed in the West. And Herrhausen said this could become the basis of a European agreement, as Charles de Gaulle had talked about, from the Atlantic to the Urals. And so the day before he was going to deliver a speech on this, I think it was November 30th, 1989, Herrhausen was assassinated. And a couple months later, the head of the Treuhand, which was the trust that was selling off the East German industries, he was assassinated, Rohwedder. There were a number of other people killed. In Italy, you had Aldo Moro assassinated. And before that, right before the Kennedy assassination, Enrico Mattei, who was the head of Eni, the Italian National Energy Agency, which was working on deals with Russia at that time, he died in a very suspicious plane crash in 1961. So you take a look across this long history, and you see a continuity. Leaders who were trying to bring the world together around mutual benefit were the ones who were targeted and killed. Some were called communists, some were called socialists. Moro was considered a traitor to Italy because he was talking about bringing the Communist Party into the government. The reason for that was the best way to ensure economic peace in Italy and not to give power to the communists. And you may remember, John, he was kidnapped. He disappeared for a month or so, and then they found his body. So it's really quite a compelling story. And of course, before Mattei and Kennedy were killed, Lumumba was killed right before John Kennedy became inaugurated. And Lumumba was important because he represented a leadership of the anti-colonial forces in Africa. And these anti-colonial forces continue to be killed up to the present day, including most recently Gaddafi. What was his crime? Trying to set up an African currency based on gold, petroleum, diamonds, physical goods. So the continuity is overwhelming in terms of the evidence of a coordinated effort.
And on Gaddafi, I would add the irrigation of the country at national expense, which would have been fantastic for the common people, the farms, and the production of good, healthy food. It was too threatening for the powers that be that some model might arise that could actually free us from their system. Wow, a lot in what you said. I told you before the show, I've been on my Monday shows, been reading from this book, a fairly rare book called A Law Unto Itself, The Untold Story of the Law Firm of Sullivan and Cromwell by Nancy Lizagore and Frank Lipsius. And in the part 6, which I was reading yesterday, it became so obvious that Alan Dulles was defying all of the clear signs that rearming Germany was a bad idea. As a matter of fact, it was illegal to rearm Germany. So they fashioned, and he was at the heart of it, what you know as the Dawes Plan, and he was able to subvert that from a government supervised reparations payment to a private loan system, and then he went out and sold the loans, or at least engaged the bankers and the bankers agents to sell the loans. Those are all the loans that caused the crash of of uh, of 29 in part, but also that's the money that rebuilt the German war industry, and he knew that it was going there, and he did it intentionally because it was his desire to rebuild the German war machine, knowing that it was going to lead to another war. And this is resonant with what's going on right now, with our war machine pushing more and more materiel, tanks, ammunition, you name it, whatever is needed in order to support this Zelensky regime. And that, to me, is another case of insanity from any rational point of view, from people that want to, to love the earth, to save humanity, to avoid World War III. In other words, it's starting to sound a lot like the Pike Mazzini letter of 3 world wars, and these people are determined to bring on World War III. Do you agree with me?
Well, just look at what happened today at Davos. The keynote was given by Zelenska, the first lady of Ukraine, who stood up there talking about how the poor Ukrainians are being victimized and you're not doing enough to help. You have these British defense officials touring all the European countries demanding that they come to the Ramstein air base on Friday with concrete plans to provide weapons. Enormous pressure being put on Germany to sell the Leopard or the Leopard tanks, or not sell them, but to deliver them to Ukraine. And if you listen to people who actually know something about this, like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, these weapons are not going to be the Wunderwaffen that will win the war. They're going to be delivered late in the game. The Ukrainians are not trained for them. The Ukrainian military has been getting decimated. The question then is, how much intention will the Europeans accept, or how much will they go along with the idea that destroying Russia and destroying China is a good idea? And, I think I have an interesting quote for you, John, from a Chinese official who was talking about the rules-based order. And he was asked about what do you think of this Japan alliance? And he said, look, after World War II, the decision was made that Japan had inflicted enough misery on the people of Asia. So that's why MacArthur chose to limit Japan's capability to purely defensive. And then he went on to say, this is a quote from Wang Wenbin, who's a foreign ministry spokesman: the US preaches the so-called rules-based order, but is second to none when it comes to undermining international rules and order. And then he went through the policies of sanctions, wars, coercive diplomacy, and he said, facts prove time and time again that the US does not care about rules or order. It cares about only one thing: the perpetuation of US hegemony. Any existing rule that stands in the way of US interests will be ignored, replaced, or even thrown out the window, even if it was proposed and written by the US itself. I think that's a very good definition of what the rules-based order is. And yet we keep hearing that what we're fighting for in Ukraine is to defend the rules-based order, which, it's nowhere evident in US actual policy.
Well, here's what bothers me about that type of comment, which is aimed solely at the United States. Because if we end up with a world that's convinced that the United States is the great Satan, and once we take down the great Satan, then everything's going to be fine, then I think we've shot ourselves in the foot. We need to bring in all of the depth behind the great Satan, and that goes directly to the financial system and directly to all of the British and colonial and Dutch and the ancient history materials that you all have brought forward over many years of very, very dedicated study. And as the rest of us come to realize that this empire that has, this mythical empire that we think of as kind of a comic thing, that it still exerts, not only does it still exert, but it continues to extend its influence into more and more corners of the earth through the financial powers of speculation, banking, just outright deceit, blackmail, murder, as we speak of, assassinations. And it continues and continues and continues without anybody holding it responsible. And so I agree that it is the United States that is the weapon that is we're the club, okay, that we're saying, if you don't do this, then the United States is going to whack you. But we're not the generating force behind this imperial power that appears to me to be destined, if we don't stop it, to achieve a totalitarian world.
Well, you're absolutely right. And as you know quite well, as you were just saying, that we have always differentiated between the American system, which in fact is what most of the world was moving toward at the end of the 19th century, which led the British to adopt the theory or the doctrine of geopolitics as a strategy for containing the American system. From the time of our nation's founding, the British did not give up trying to undermine the Hamiltonian, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin influence, which was a scientific approach to government, using the capability of a government to defend and advance labor productivity through science and technology, through infrastructure development, and through protection from purely private speculative capital. And we were talking about assassinations. Alexander Hamilton was assassinated. This goes back to the 1790s. I mean, Hamilton was killed by Aaron Burr, who was working on behalf of British financial interests. And after he killed Hamilton, he escaped through Canada to Britain. And this just gives you an example of what we've been up against for several centuries. So I agree with you completely. The problem is that at this point, virtually the entire political class in the United States, in both parties, is reading from a British script. And the idea that we have to defend the world from Russia, defend it from China. And one of the things they're talking about at Davos, which they're calling reglobalization, is how do you reorganize the world economy so you have no need to be connected with Russia or China? Total decoupling. And I can tell you from the case of Germany and France in particular, and even Italy, decoupling from Russia and China will have leave a huge hole in the economy. On the first case, just in terms of the cheap oil and gas that was part of the German economy in the last 20, 30 years, the oil and gas from Russia, that may be gone forever. And you're not going to replace it with solar and wind. So what happens with Germany? Well, German firms are talking about moving to other countries, including Tajikistan, including China, including the United States. And ironically, the Biden administration is opening the door for some of these firms to come to the United States as part of economic warfare against Europe, even as they're proclaiming their profound unity with Europe. Now that's where you see the British deviousness being sold to dumb Americans who LaRouche always said it's the British brains and American brawn. That's how the British look at it. And NATO is a perfect example of that. Most of NATO couldn't police the parade grounds from cigarette butts, but they've become a force because of the weaponization, largely from the military industrial complex. That's where some of these weapon systems are coming from. And now, look, they're talking about placing US nuclear weapons in Germany. And there are some US nuclear weapons there, but they're talking about significant expansion of that, and even in Japan. And just on the Japan thing, so ironic that Kishida, who's the prime minister, is going to be the head of the G7 coming up. The next G7 conference is going to be in Japan. You know where it's going to be? Hiroshima. Have the Japanese learned nothing? The one country that's been targeted by nuclear weapons, that they're now preparing to change their constitution so they can have nuclear weapons to confront China. This is where you see the pure insanity, John.
But it's not necessarily just insanity. It's also that their backs are against the wall, as they have been since World War II, with our MacArthur, who sometimes I view as a great man, and sometimes I view as somebody who's living in the 19th century with the idea of dominating the brown people or the Asian races. I think that was part of who he was, and perhaps I'm wrong, but it seems to me that he exerted a very domineering influence, if not him, then the people under him. And that ever since then, Japan has been dancing to a tune that has been, prescribed by American power. And right now, I think, is another example of it, where their economy is kind of being strangled in order to force them to go along with American policy. Am I right?
Well, here's some recent figures. Japan has just decided to increase defense spending by 26% in the next 2 years. That's going to be up to $50 billion a year. Now, that's out of a total budget of $839 billion. So at the same time, their debt service is $175 billion, or 20% of the budget. So Japan's economy is going through a severe debt crisis, and yet they're going to add to that by their spending on defense. Now, in terms of the Japanese outlook, the economy has been stagnant much of the last 20 years. I mean, Japan, actually going back to the 80s, became sort of the model for what was called stagflation. And the Japanese were going towards something called the Mitsubishi Plan. Now, the Mitsubishi company had the original ideas that were incorporated in the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Major infrastructure projects, canals, for example, the Kra Canal in Thailand, building up new ports all over East Asia, high-speed rail, transportation corridors, power plants. That was Mitsubishi. And instead, the Japanese got brought into two aspects of it. One was the artificial intelligence side of things, which connected to Silicon Valley, Taiwan, South Korea. But the other part of it was speculation. And the Japanese banks, which had been largely under MacArthur's influence, and I'll just say this about MacArthur, whatever else he was, he did believe in the idea of the American system. And he said when Japan functioned well, it was when in the Meiji Restoration, where they took power away from the private wealthy families and established a banking system that lent money for physical economic development. And that was the Meiji Restoration, the American system. It was in 1902 the British shifted that by saying to Japan, look, you should be the major power in Asia, and we're going to create a series of bonds for you that will give you the capability for a military buildup. That's what happened with Japan in 1902. That's why this new agreement is so significant, because they're basically saying, here's the way out of your economic crisis. Play a bigger role as a controller in Asia, as a counter to China, and do a military buildup. That's the same policy that's going on in the United States, because the people behind Biden know the Green New Deal is not going to build an economy, but a military buildup will, at least in the short term, produce jobs and economic improvement, short term. Now, then the other thing you have, which is going on in the US, and I'll just throw this out, I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. The Biden document scandal. Well, almost everyone is pairing it as the other side of the coin with Trump. There's another side to this, which is that I have people I've talked to who say that they believe that the Obama team is using this to get rid of Biden and to basically say that, look, Joe, you're old, you're sick, your wife has cancer. Here's a chance for you to step aside and retain some of your dignity. Now, the question I ask them is, well, what are you going to do? You're going to be stuck with Harris. She's certainly not an inspiring figure. And what I was told is they're planning a massive infusion of quantitative easing and a defense buildup. Our defense budget is now well over 800 billion. We're talking about another 50 to 100 billion for Ukraine. They actually think they can create a recovery to make Harris look good, at least in the short term, to get through 2024. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I'm saying that's what some people are talking about. And you see the short-term thinking, which is so dangerous, especially when you're toying around with this prospect of a third world war.
Well, thanks for teaching me some stuff about MacArthur that I didn't know and probably should know more about. I think that resonates with the idea that he had to go, and perhaps he wanted to build up Japan as Japan. And
Well, he had an ego. There's no question about that. He clashed with people, including Eisenhower. On the other hand, one of the people who I got to know when I was in Texas for many years was Senator Ralph Yarborough. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was one of the few Southern Democrats who supported the civil rights movement. And Yarborough had been an aide under MacArthur. He was one of the people in charge of the reconstruction of the Japanese legal system after the war. And what he told me is that they made a real effort to make sure that instead of power in the hands of the equivalent of warlords, you actually had civil government that made sure there were benefits for the entire population. And for a while, Japan had almost no poverty. And the only time they had that previously was when they conquered territories like Mongolia, Taiwan, China, and so on. So my view of MacArthur is somewhat shaped by the reports I got from Senator Yarborough, who was a very fascinating figure. He was the candidate who he beat George Bush, I think it was in 1964. He beat George H.W. Bush in a Senate race. And in that Senate race, Yarborough did research on Bush's role as a skull and bones, as part of the Harriman networks. He showed me his files. He had files this thick of papers on the Eastern establishment and the Bush family. But Yarborough, as I said, was a civil rights supporter close to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And in 1970, the decision was made to run Bush again against Yarborough. But the same people who were supporting Bush poured money into Lloyd Benson. And Lloyd Benson ended up beating Yarborough as a conservative Democratic senator, and then Benson crushed Bush in the general election in 1970. So, you dig deep in the Texas uh, arena and you find a lot of interesting things with national and international politics.
And oil depletion allowances.
Yes.
Oh boy. Yeah, Texas is a mess, but once again, it's one of those things that there's a lot about Texas I really do respect and love, and there's the the elites of every flavor seem to have a character that's willing to take advantage of us, even to the extent of sending us to war, getting us killed, and thinking nothing of it. It's like there's two classes of humanity, as in the Middle Ages with the nobles and the serfs. I think they're trying to bring that back. They're homesick for the Middle Ages.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Feudalism.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's what, when you take away sovereignty, where did sovereignty come from? The idea of sovereignty was introduced at the time of the middle of the 15th century, a little bit before that, the Council of Florence in 1437, which tried to unify the Christian church. And this was around the figure of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who essentially said the only purpose of a government is to act in the interests of its people. And that was the problem with feudalism. The feudal leaders didn't care for the people. They were interested in their own comfort and their own wealth. And it was Cusa's intervention which created the basis for the modern nation state, with Louis XI of France being the first modern leader, and then the Tudor Revolution under Henry VII in England, which overthrew the Plantagenets, Richard III. The Henry Tudor came up with this idea, which was based on Louis XI's idea of the state, which is that the state should protect its industry. That protectionism was designed to enable a nation to develop its own economy, not at the expense of other economies, but to be able to more effectively interrelate with other countries. Louis XI was known as the Spider King because he had all these manipulations to negotiate with other countries, but his purpose was to defend France as a state with a power over and above the local oligarchs, the local aristocrats. And it was this model which Jean-Baptiste Colbert, under, unfortunately, Louis XIV, who was not a good king, but Colbert came up with this idea, which was called mercantilism, but protectionism, the state funding artisans and development. And one of the people who was brought in to the French project under Colbert was Gottfried Leibniz. And Leibniz learned from that the principles of statecraft, which he wrote about, which became the model for Ben Franklin in the American Revolution. So you see, this fight against feudalism was crucial for shaping the United States. And the United States was an anti-colonial, the first real successful anti-colonial movement by overthrowing the British Empire, taking power away from them. And the British, on behalf of global aristocracy, never forgave the United States for that, to this day.
No, and somehow we still worship their aristocracy. I mean, the crumbs off of the table of the nobility sell ink like nothing. I mean, gossip about this one or that one. Boy, you're got a bestseller. And
Well, it's interesting, the story of Prince Harry. There are two aspects to it. One that's not gotten much attention is that there's a belief that he's still suffering from not just the loss of his mother, Princess Diana, but his belief that there were elements in the royal family, or at least in the monarchy, that were involved in killing her.
yeah,
But at the same time, you see the British racism in his writing about what he did in Afghanistan. that when he said when he was in a helicopter as a pilot and was shooting at the Taliban, he said it was, you didn't think of them as people, you just thought of them as targets. And I think that expresses the attitude of the British aristocracy. So you see the potential conflict there. But what's it turned into? A soap opera, so that people get sucked into choosing sides.
Well, isn't that exactly what happened to Henry VII? Is Henry VIII? Because Henry VIII was nothing but a big soap opera from beginning to end, and everybody relives the different wives and everything, and it's all about Henry VIII, but it's not. Nobody knows anything about Henry VII except for you and the scholarly world. But you've described something that's very, very important that is obscured by normal history books.
Well, where the place you find it is Shakespeare, and this shows you how they've transformed the education system. The play Henry V, which people use to say George W. Bush was a Henry V character, a dissolute hellraiser as a youth, but then as a wartime leader, he was heroic. The speech he gave before the major battle against France. And what they miss is that in Shakespeare's histories of the Plantagenets, the beginning of the play Henry V starts with the church leaders talking about how they're afraid that the churches will be taxed, and therefore they need wars to distract the population. And so they want Henry V to be a wartime leader. And those people who then think that Henry V was such a great figure, as Shakespeare seemed to be building him up, don't read the beginning of Henry VI, the next play, because what's the first thing that happens in Henry VI? Henry V died. His heir is, I think, 13 months old. The ruling powers have grabbed control again, and the country's bankrupt, and they just lost France. So, there's the history was laid out by Shakespeare to give people a sense of the importance of Henry VII and to try to affect the post-Elizabeth period. Because you talk about conniving and conspiracies, the British intelligence under John Dee and these networks that were conspiring, the Cecils and the Stuarts and others, to see who's going to replace Queen Elizabeth I. That's what Shakespeare was trying to do, is say to the people of England, we had a great history, we had a great leader, let's look at what was done there. And instead today, we read these plays as soap operas, if we read them at all.
Or watch them as actual battle scenes. Wow, look at that. But I have to say, I still love to watch Kenneth Branagh's Henry V. I could watch it 100 times.
Well, it's that's Hollywood's spin on it, but
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Branagh did create a sympathetic figure, but it stops, of course, before the end of his life. And if you actually would extend that into the next play, you'd see that all that good rhetoric, what did it end up doing? Killing a lot of people in England and France and leave the country in a mess.
And his reign didn't even last a year after the battle.
Yeah.
It's and again, if you look at it as a lesson in history, you see, that they use these warriors to go out there and they promise them, you're going to get all this. And I love, the sin upon our heads, my liege. So the church is saying, don't worry about going to heaven. We'll get you to heaven. You just go out there and conquer France, and here's a bundle of money to pay for your ships to get over there. Wow.
And whatever you do, don't tax the churches.
And don't tax. Yeah. Don't remember who gave you the money.
And then what was Henry VIII about? Henry VIII was convinced to break with the Vatican, which in itself might not have been so bad, but to create a church which was dependent on him, under his control.
Yeah, they could have got him a divorce if they'd really wanted to. Yeah, I mean, what, you're God, right? You're God's mission on earth. You can do what God wants.
Well,
God,
and this, of course, brings us back to, I think, is one of your favorite plays, Macbeth,
yeah.
and the way corruption works. And the witches scene is an incredibly brilliant invention by Shakespeare. But you see real characters and the importance of Banquo's ghost, and then the emergence of Macduff. So we've got to use this. I mean, these are the building blocks of modern civilization, and they're being thrown out. Nobody knows about them. Nobody studies them. The other element in Shakespeare is the whole expose of the Venetian method. When you look, everyone focuses on the Merchant of Venice as anti-Semitic. No, it's not. It's the whole society which was corrupt. And similarly, the Othello, the same thing. Again, it's Venice. Why was Shakespeare focused on Venice? Because the Venetians who were camped out in Amsterdam, who retreated to Northern Europe and set up the Bank of the Netherlands National Bank, they became the force that moved into England and set up the Bank of England. And Shakespeare was warning about this. Beware the Venetians.
And Othello is a perfect example of the good soldier that goes out and wins, for the state. And at the end of the play, they take him away anyway
He's
because
destroyed. Yeah.
he's destroyed. Yeah, I mean that's and again, I mean it's not the first time I've said that resonates very deeply with me with what happened, to my father.
Yeah.
Um, I think really to characterize it with the hindsight I have now, he was put in a position to be a part of Alan Dulles' secret team, as described by Fletcher Prouty, and he
Mhm.
refused. He would not be the secret team at the Pentagon for Alan Dulles, and he paid the price.
And the importance of resurrecting the story is to show that not everybody capitulated, and that there were people who had a higher sense of principle. And we need to study that, because you've got to have an inspiration from somewhere. And that's why at the end of our conference on Saturday, Dennis Speed read the letter that Lumumba wrote to his wife right before he was killed. A beautiful letter where he says, whatever happens to me, our nation will survive, our nation will flourish. I hope that my sons will be a part of that. And you get a sense of someone who's not bowed by the intervention of the CIA and the imperial forces. And then you look at Kennedy's speeches, his last UN address in September 1963, the American University speech, where you see the change going on with Kennedy. And then MLK's I've been to the mountaintop speech. And what I think is important, and I again refer this back to what you've done with your father, is we need figures that inspire in us a sense that it's not being a sucker to fight for higher principles, that without those fights, civilization goes into the gutter. And that's where we're headed right now, unless we find in ourselves that higher nobility that Lincoln talked about on the question of the better angels in ourselves.
Speaking of last letters, just received a copy of one from the county jail in Limerick, dated the first on the 19th of January, 1923. My darling Jenny, Patty, Vincent, and Joe, just a note to say goodbye forevermore to this earth. But we shall meet again in heaven someday. Myself and Con were tried by court martial, found guilty, and sentenced to death on the most frivolous evidence. We were tried at midnight on Wednesday night, called from our cells where we were asleep, got no chance to defend ourselves. Our lives were sworn away. I forgive them from the bottom of my heart, for there is a God to judge them on the last day, as well as there is to judge me me and Con are in separate cells. Father McCready came to see us here tonight, and he gave us his blessing. The letter goes on, and I think there are thousands and thousands of such letters in people's memories and people's hearts from men and women who have stood up to the empire, who have paid the ultimate price.
And
And
that's a price they paid for us
exactly,
to stand up and do the same thing.
and it's a privilege.
Yeah.
Thank you, Harley. Everybody, we'll see you tomorrow night, Wednesday night trio, this time with David and Bill Taylor. So that'll be a lot of fun. And we'll catch up with what those very good researchers have been doing. Harley Slanger, thank you very, very much.
Okay, John. See you in 2 weeks.